Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today with this second of our September events. We have today the amazing Meurig Bowen. So Meurig, welcome and thank you very much for this amazing hour that we will have. So just to let you know all, we will start with Meurig's biography, then we will have around 30 minutes of interview, and then it's all for you to ask him questions. So feel free to write them in the chat or raise your hand. So let's begin. So Meurig Bowen is one of the leading British arts administrators who has worked mainly in festival and orchestral programming. He was educated at King's College, Cambridge, where he was a choral scholar. Then 6 years at a London artist management company, where he was administrator of the Hilliard Ensemble, were followed by a further 6 years working in Sydney as artistic administrator of the Australian Chamber Orchestra. He returned to the UK as director of the Lichfield Festival and subsequently head of programming at the Alpro Festival, before becoming artistic director of the Cheltenham Music Festival, where he succeeded Martin Robbins in 2007. Bowen stepped down from his role at the Cheltenham Music Festival in December 2017, take up the new role of Head of Artistic Planning at BBC National Orchestra and Chorus of Wales. He is also the classical programmer for St George's, Bristol. In April 2017, Quarto Books published The School of Music, a children's book he co-wrote with his wife Rachel and has been translated into many languages since 2018. He is also a music journalist and commentator who regularly writes for the national press and also writes distinctive city liner notes, notably for the Hyperion label. After 3 years at BBC Now, he began this year his tenure as the CEO and artistic director of the Britten Sinfonia. So Meurig, this is a really fantastic opportunity. So now it's over to Izzy to start with the questions.
Hello there. Could you tell us a little bit about your job, both as CEO and artistic director, and what it involves, and what your pathway into being an artistic administrator was?
Yes, I can tell you, answer both those things happily. I've only been doing my current job for a month. I went on the payroll with Britten Sinfonia only on the 1st of August. So at one level, I'm not particularly well qualified to answer that question because I'm only been on board for about 5 weeks. But broadly speaking, I head up administratively and artistically a team of currently 11 or 12 colleagues of mine in the administration management team, and I'm responsible ultimately for the financial and artistic and administrative health of the Britten Sinfonia, which, if some of you don't know, is a wonderful British chamber orchestra which has been going for nearly 30 years, established in and around Cambridge in 1992, and has really cut its own path since then as a very innovative chamber orchestra, very all sorts of different sizes. It can be a quartet or a quintet in certain circumstances that do quite a lot of chamber music, and it can be a 60 or 70 piece chamber philharmonic sized orchestra, and everything in between. But broadly speaking, I would say the Britten Sinfonia, its normal concert activities are as a chamber orchestra of between 20 and 40 players. They actually did their first real proper concert again since lockdown on Friday night, just 3 nights ago, in the Albert Hall, one of the live proms without audience, with the British Indian sitar player Anushka Shankar and percussionist Manu Delagu. And so it was really wonderful to be back, and to nothing to do with me. The concert had come in before I started the job, but it was really lovely for me so early in the job to be able to literally say hello to and meet the players, because I hadn't done that in many cases before. And in fact, I'm still yet to meet some of my colleagues in management, because we're all working remotely still, and you can imagine that it's been quite an unusual start to a job, basically working remotely. I've been in Cambridge a couple of days, but mostly I'm working from where I live in Cheltenham, still in Gloucestershire. The other question, what was my path? You've had that Wikipedia-based biography from Stefano, but my path has, I suppose, been organic. I can honestly tell you, if it's of interest to you, for you to know, that at no point early on in my life did I sit down and say, by the age of 30, I want to be doing this, or I want to be working for so and so, or I've never really had a 5-year or 10-year plan. I don't know whether any of you guys already do. Each to their own, really. It's been quite an organic process for me. My father was a musician, a tenor, Welsh tenor, quite a busy concert singer in my youth, and then as his singing faded, he became head of vocal studies at the Royal Academy of Music. So he taught a lot of singers, and I was part of through the family, was part of a really interesting musical community in London in my youth, in the 70s and 80s. And I was a chorister in my local parish church choir in North London. I played the viola in the London School Symphony Orchestra. I went to a local state school, which happened to be a very, very fine school musically. It was a very fine school, full stop, but musically it was particularly special, and had lots of opportunities to do really lots of high-level music as a school boy. And then, very fortunately, I was very lucky to get a choral scholarship to Cambridge after school, after my A-levels, and after a year off, because I'm a great believer in year offs. Maybe you can ask me about that later, or gap years. I went to Cambridge and read music for 3 years and was in the choir at King's College, Cambridge. Played the viola a bit, less and less though, and in fact I haven't really played the viola since my mid-20s, which I miss a little bit, but not that much. And then I had another year off after university and was an au pair boy in Germany. So there really wasn't anything strategic about that at all, except that I possibly just wanted to learn to speak another language better. And then after trying to get a job and failing to get an interview for various things, a first job in arts admin, which, as some of you will know, is not necessarily the easiest thing to get. I found myself 2 weeks worth of work experience at an agency in North London, a concert agency, which doesn't exist anymore, but subsequently in the mid-90s got sort of subsumed into Hazard Chase, which sadly, as some of you may know, has since ceased to exist earlier this year, straight after lockdown. But this company specialized in early music and in choirs and choruses, and I got a job there as the administrator of the Hilliard Ensemble, and that's sort of where the official bit of the biography starts. Really fortunate in that job to fall on my feet and work with a really wonderful top-notch vocal ensemble specializing in contemporary and old ancient music. And the two high points, I suppose, of those 6 years was getting to work through the Hilliard's diary with Arvo Pärt a lot. We did a lot of new music pieces that he was writing at the time for them, and touring those pieces around the world. And also then in 1993, they collaborated with the Norwegian saxophonist Jan Garbarek with the first of what turned out to be 3 albums with him. Amazingly successful. Hard for you young people to imagine that a CD in the 90s could sell 1 million copies within 6 months. 1 million hard copies. And I think they were expensive. ECM, German CD label, they were always very expensive. I seem to remember even then the album was 12 or 13 pounds. So, that's a long time ago for 1 million people to be spending 13 or 14 pounds on a CD. But lots of people did, and that project toured around the world, and I was very fortunate to catch that wave, as it were. But towards the end of my 20s, I felt that I needed to finish doing that, and I wanted to do something completely different. So I jacked in the job and got a backpacker's working holiday visa to Australia just before I would be too old to get it at the age of 29. And I went to Sydney, where I had some family, and I wanted to explore Australia for a bit. And fell on my feet there, expected to be there for just a few months, but actually found myself working for the Australian Chamber Orchestra in their box office, just as a kind of backpacker's temp job. And somehow, amazingly, serendipitously, at the time, they were looking for somebody to do some freelance artist and repertoire research for the director and lead violinist of the orchestra, Richard Tognetti. And they discovered that this strange British person working in their box office had a music degree and had some time on his hands. So they asked me to do it. And within a few months of that going well and me getting on with Richard well, they offered me a job as artistic administrator. Some of you will understand that title. It sort of does what it says on the tin. It's the artistic side of admin. And after I had to come back to the UK to get a fresh visa. But after that, I was there for another 5 years as artistic administrator of the Australian Chamber Orchestra, one of the most amazing orchestras on the planet then, and I think still is. And that was a really formative time for me, and I think that was the real turning point for me, which made me realize that I could possibly have a future on the artistic side of things rather than the admin side of things. I can do admin. Some colleagues of mine over the years will say I'm not the most rigorously organized person on the planet, but I'm not entirely disorganized either, but it perhaps isn't my greatest strength, whereas I, through my work at the ACO, began to realize that I had a facility for and an enthusiasm for coming up with ideas of repertoire and pairing them with particular artists and coming up with programs that seemed of interest to Richard and the orchestra and their audience. So it was from there really that my career, if you like, went in that particular artistic direction. And so mid-30s, my visa was coming to an end in Sydney, and I applied for a job, or the job of director of the Licktree Festival, which is a kind of mid-sized arts festival in the Midlands, north of Birmingham, and got it, which meant I suddenly had to leave Australia, which is the biggest wrench of my life. But it felt as though it was the right time to make that kind of decision. And I very much enjoyed the fresh responsibility of running my own show and being the artistic and executive director of a small to mid-sized festival. And from there, that led on to my job in Aldeburgh, and then subsequently, after another year off, I hasten to say, I created another sabbatical for myself in my early 40s after my time in, no, it wasn't my early 40s, it was my, around my early 40s. I created another sabbatical for myself between, I just left Aldeburgh because I wanted some time out. And then a few months later, very fortunate to get the job as director of the Cheltenham Music Festival out in Gloucestershire. And I moved from, I was living in London at the time. So yeah, I'd been in Sydney, Suffolk, Sydney, Staffordshire and Suffolk, all beginning with S, and then London, and then out west to Gloucestershire, and that's where I still am in Cheltenham. And I did Cheltenham for 10 years. Maybe talk about that more in a moment, but finished that in 2018 and did 2.5 years BBC National Orchestra of Wales, commuting from Cheltenham West out to Cardiff 2 or 3 days a week. as head of artistic planning there. That was a very long double answer, but maybe time for another question.
Thank you, Meurig. That's an amazing CV that you have, and it will kick off many questions. The one that I have that I'm very interested in is that you have been head of programming at several festivals, halls, and with orchestras. So I wanted to ask you, what are the secrets of programming, and how have you shaped this aspect of music to stimulate audiences, to invigorate composers, and to attract new artists?
What are the secrets? I think the first thing is to have your ears and eyes open all the time, to be really receptive to lots of ideas and approaches, literally approaches. I think some people in my position regard approaches from agents and musicians and composers as nuisance calls, as spam. But actually, I think that's a pretty dangerous position to be in if you just sort of stay in your own little channel and you're not open to all these ideas and proposals coming to you. So I think the first ground rule is to be really open and to have your ears open all the time. And sort of related to that, and I do say this to various people, and sometimes I get stunned looks of surprise and lack of engagement with the concept, but I actually would encourage any of you, if you don't already, who want to get on in the music world, to listen to Radio 3 as much as possible. Anybody who doesn't, and I have been at various sort of student gatherings where I ask people to put their hands up whether they listen to Radio 3, and I'm deeply shocked by how few hands go up sometimes. Call me old-fashioned, but it's absolutely the best way to keep those eyes and ears open and to become or to remain a student of music. I mean, I've learned so much more about music since I graduated from university over 30 years ago, and Radio 3 has been my main educator. So you know, that is really big for me, and I stress for any of you who are receptive to that idea. Yeah, so being really receptive to everything that's out there, getting out there, going to lots of concerts, not just listening to CDs or streaming music or listening to the radio, just getting out there. And then once you've got all these different things in your pot, in your sort of planning pot that you stir in your brain, sometimes in the middle of the night when you're asleep and you don't even realize you're doing it, the more you put into that pot, the more you're likely to get out of it. And that sounds slightly trite maybe, but the more ideas you put into that mix, the more likely you are that some really unusual mixes and combinations are going to come out the other end when you're thinking of what might be paired with such and such. If you wake up one morning and or an artist or a composer has said to you, I'd really like to do X piece in a program, but they don't necessarily, or you don't necessarily immediately have an idea what might go with X. If you've populated your brain with all sorts of different, sometimes weird and wonderful things, then you've got a much better chance of pulling out some potentially riveting and unusual things to pair with those things. So I think you just have to be really open and receptive to all the wonderful, incredibly diverse things that are out there at the moment. And of course, as the years go by, it gets even more wonderful and diverse, and literally diverse. You know, the music business, as you'll know, has changed enormously just in the last few years, and there is so much more of a important and right emphasis on true diversity in music, whether that's BME composers, or women conductors or women composers. And my artistic planning life has become, as a result, that much more, yes, complicated, because you have to consider so many different things all the time and triangulate all these different things, but not just complicated, but more importantly, wonderful and rich and challenging in the best way. So yeah, I mean, sometimes I think what it must have been like to have been a concert planner in, I don't know, 1980 or 1950. Imagine if you're putting together a concert in 1950 and you know, some of your favorite pieces that subsequently were written in from 1951 onwards just didn't exist and weren't in that pot to be stirred around. Can you imagine how much less intriguing and rich the possibilities might have been all those years ago? So I think if you can get to this position where you're in this, you know, really absurd privilege that I am to play with all these different toys and to put them all together, if you can get to that position, 2020, well, maybe not 2020, but 2019 or 2021 are brilliant years to be doing it.
Thank you, Meurig. That's fantastic. We have a question related to the topic by Lada Valisova. So Lada, would you like to ask it?
Yes. Hello.
Hi there.
Thank you for being here. Wonderful. I wanted to ask you, how do you get the right balance between lesson on composers you might want to advocate for and the necessity, which we always hear about, to sell the program to the wider audience? So let's say you want to put on some Weinberger or Pavel Haas or people like that. And often one hears, well, be careful because that will put people off. And it's a very fine balance, I guess. I mean, what would be your advice on that? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Obviously, it's one that I'm constantly considering, and a lot of us are constantly considering. One answer, if you do want to have a concert exclusively of an obscure composer who didn't write any big box office pieces, then make sure that it's in a small venue and doesn't cost you very much. And therefore, the financial risk of booking just a cheapish, youngish string quartet to do Pavel Haas's quartets, for example, you mentioned him. Make sure that you're not exposing yourself too much to that risk. If you don't have, I mean, that is very much the festival programmer giving you that answer, because the wonderful thing about a festival is that it has a wide range of venues at its disposal. And in the festivals that I've worked in, say Cheltenham for 10 years, I had the enormous privilege of working with fairly large venues like Gloucester Cathedral or Cheltenham Town Hall or Tewkesbury Abbey, all of which had capacities of 800 or 900, and you could afford to spend quite a lot of money on those events as long as you were sure that you were going to be absolutely packed for those events, because then you'd have a pretty good chance of making the sums add up at the end. But ranging from those big venues down to tiny little churches in the Cotswolds that only held 70 people, or late night spaces that just held 120, and you could put on something quite edgy and with, again, you know, younger, cheaper performers, or maybe just a solo pianist, maybe got a well-known, more expensive pianist, but because you're only paying for one pianist rather than a symphony orchestra, the cost risk is relatively low. And you could, so as a festival programmer, you have the option to consider to spread your risk across lots of different venues with their different capacities, their different earning potentials through box office revenue. If you're not in that position, and if you are running a space that has a fixed capacity, and it's a large capacity, and everything you need to put in there costs a certain amount of money to just make sense of that capacity, i.e. a large concert hall or opera space, then my answer to your question would be to work out some really clever pairings and combinations of repertoire, so that, and you know, of course I'm not the first person to be advocating this, because it's been done like this for decades, but make sure that there's a big box office piece in there that you, either because of the soloist or because of the piece itself, you're quite confident is going to sell that concert very well on its own. And then you put something less well known, more obscure, more niche alongside it. And don't just put those things in randomly. Make sure that there's a compelling connection. Like, for example, thinking about Pavel Haas again, because he was a student of Janacek's, I think. Is that right? You know, or I don't know, just pair the composers or pair the work so that there's a narrative in your blurb, in the brochure or on the website, or if you're going to do a pre-concert talk, to get people getting it and understanding why those pieces have been paired. Just make sure that there's a really strong reason for those pieces having been put together. Another way, as I talk and as I think more about your question, another way of getting more obscure repertoire into programs, so that we're widening that repertoire that I was talking about earlier, rather than being risk averse and narrowing it all the time, is, and this is a really tricky one, but it can be done, is getting really solid box office names to take on tricky repertoire. And I'm thinking of Nicola Benedetti. She came with her, well, she was in residence a couple of times in my time in Cheltenham, and she came with her piano trio, and she did solo recital with piano, and she did concertos and things. But I remember in her piano trio concert, funny enough, I can't remember what the main piece was. It was probably Beethoven or Rachmaninoff or something. But they offered to us the world premiere of a piece by, and the name is completely escaping me now, but it'll come to me at some stage. She teaches in Cardiff, and one of you is going to help me. One of you is going to send a little. Sorry,
Ferrando, I think the surname. No, I can't remember now exactly how it's pronounced. Not helping. Sorry.
It'll come to me. It'll come to me. Answers on a postcard or in the chat, please. Anyway, they were offering the world premiere of a trio that she'd written, and I thought, okay, so this could be a little bit tricky, because generally speaking, you don't put world premieres on of chamber music in a 900-seat concert hall, and I wouldn't have considered it if it hadn't had the sort of golden ticket of Nicola Benedetti attached to it. But I did, and that concert was sold out, and 900 people heard a piece that, if it had been done, frankly, by another piano trio in a venue half the size, it still wouldn't have been full. So, you know, Shake You is another one, or, you know, there are just a few soloists out there at the moment who have such purchase with a wider box office audience, that they could pretty much play anything and they'll turn up. I mean, famously, in my final year in Cheltenham, I got, and I'd been asking for years, but I finally got Bryn Terfel to come and do a recital in the town hall. And the concert sold out before we announced any repertoire. You know, on how many occasions can you do that nowadays with classical artists? Like, you know, a pop or rock band doesn't need to tell you that they're going to be performing certain pieces from certain albums before you decide whether you want to go. You just go because you want to see that band. And there are very few classical artists who have that pulling power, but somebody like Bryn did and does. And we sold out that Cheltenham Town Hall with very high ticket prices, embarrassingly high ticket prices, but everybody wanted to hear him. And only subsequently, once they'd committed that money for the tickets, did they find out what he was performing. And they were fine about that, because he delivered a very attractive program, which did have a couple of niche corners actually. So it does mean again that those people heard some slightly more unusual corners of the vocal repertoire.
Thank you so much. It's such a complete answer. I really appreciate it. And may I just follow up tiny question about the Nikki's trio? How was the new piece received, if I may?
That's a really good question. I suspect if you'd done a sort of exit poll on those 900 people, probably 700 of them probably would have said, I was glad when it was over, and I was looking forward to the second half. And that's not a reflection on the piece. It's just a reflection on the fact that a very large number of those kind of more mainstream classical music people just don't have the ears or the training to absorb the complexity of that new repertoire. I know that the sponsor of that evening, that night, who had invited 40, it was a bank or a accountancy firm or something, and they'd invited 30 or 40 corporate guests. I know, because I was slightly hauled over there. And here's the interesting thing. My colleagues in the development and fundraising department were not pleased with me because of that repertoire decision, because they got some pretty frosty feedback from the sponsors, because some of those corporate clients just didn't know what they were hearing, because they'd never come across anything like that before in their lives, because people don't, unless you seek it out nowadays. So you could argue that at one level that was a miscalculation, because maybe that sponsor wouldn't have wanted to have come back next year because they were too cross, because their relationships with some of their corporate guests had been slightly marred because of that. I don't know. That's a really tricky one, because then, I mean, and fundraising and relationship with your individual donors or your corporate sponsors, although there aren't many of those nowadays, but if you do have a relationship with some of those, you have to be incredibly careful about keeping them on side during the concert and not promising them one thing, i.e. an evening with Nicola Benedetti, and then giving them, for 20 minutes at least, something that isn't quite what they bargained for.
Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Just sort of going on from this, I saw that there was an article, I think from 2009, a long time ago, on the Guardian website from when you were working at Cheltenham regarding marketing classical music. I wondered how has your approach to marketing classical music changed over the years from your different experiences?
Interesting. I think what has changed since 2009 is obviously the power of the website, and particularly social media has completely transformed the landscape. And in 2009, one's preoccupation in the festival or the concert world was still very much around the brochure and the season brochure or the festival brochure and a piece of print that just had to be your perfect and principal selling tool. And now, although people still do that, and there's still a real need, I think, amongst the older generation at least, for a piece of physical print to pore over, especially if you're, I mean, it's well known that there's a certain kind of more mature classical music buyer or consumer who does like to plan well ahead and to think very carefully and to literally to pore over a piece of print. So I think that's still important. And in my latter years in Cheltenham, when some of my other marketing colleagues were suggesting that they weren't suggesting that we didn't do a brochure, but I think there was still a sense that the print run should be much smaller and we don't need to spend money getting it out into those racks in hotels and pubs and all of that stuff. And I always used to carry on pushing for that, because I do think that physical print, even now, has a role and is important. But obviously in the meantime, there's been this revolution with social media and the ability to watch 2 or 3 minute videos just on your phone, which when I wrote that piece in 2009 was just not, maybe it was an option for some people in 2009, but for most people it was not on the menu at all. And that's been revolutionary. And what's been really instructive about this lockdown is how classical music promoters and organizations and artists, individuals and groups, have been able to continue a relationship with their audience from their homes in lockdown through the montage videos and through quizzes and Q&As and all of the stuff that so brilliantly has been, and sometimes tediously and over profusely, has been put out there on social media. So yeah, I think that's been the massive change, and I think it's just had to change all of our thinking in a really exciting way. The best thing about it, focusing on the positives around it, is that it's much cheaper than it used to be, when everything was around expensive glossy brochures with enormous print runs and then with enormous distribution and postage costs. If that side of things has been reduced a little bit, as I think it has everywhere, it's been replaced by this virtually free of charge. I mean, it isn't free of charge, because you still have to pay for people to make the videos and to do graphic design, even if it's digital graphic design. But I think the ability at a very inexpensive level for individuals or organizations to get their message out, potentially to very large numbers of people, even around the world, not just in a certain number of postcodes, that's been a really positive revolution in the last few years.
Thank you, Meurig. That's very, very interesting. Now, following from the programming side to the more sort of visionary side, I want to ask this question focused on BBC Now, but you can choose either to compare one orchestra to a festival or according to what you prefer. But it's when you join a new company, so in which state do you find, did you inherit the new company, and what are your goals with both the company and the audience, and where to take it from there?
Wow, that's an interesting one. When I came to Cheltenham in 2008, I'd say things weren't in a particularly happy state, because my predecessor, Martin Brabbins, the conductor, had only been there for 3 years. And I think if he were here now, he would be the first person to say he hadn't had an entirely happy time there, because in that role, because of particular chemistry issues with people in management. And I won't say any more than that. I don't need to. So reputationally, because prior to that, Michael Barclay had been the previous director, and he'd been in post for 10 years and had done an amazing job. And prior to that, Sir John Mandwell, who among other things was the first principal of the Royal Northern College of Music in the 1970s and worked for the BBC and all sorts of other amazing things. He had been the artistic director of Cheltenham Music Festival for over 25 years. So to go from 25 years to 10 years and then to somebody who stuck it or did it for 3 years, I think was reputationally tricky in the wider music business, and locally, where it's all about audience relations and the local fundraising environment. That was tricky, and it wasn't anybody's fault in particular. It was just the circumstances of somebody who had done a great job for 3 years but had chosen to stop and go back to conducting. I mean, he'd been conducting anyway, but and he was always going to be carrying that on, but he chose to leave that Cheltenham job and go back to focusing solely on his conducting, which of course, wonderful career. So that was a tricky one. I wouldn't say I found Cheltenham Music Festival in an absolutely desperate state, because there were lots of great things about it and great colleagues and lots of infrastructure and knowledge from colleagues. I mean, that's I think generally speaking, that's the most important thing that you can ever hope for in a new job, is great colleagues who've been there a while, whether that's a year or 15 years, and know and love the organization a lot and can share their knowledge and are and can give you a soft landing. And that's what I'm currently happily experiencing in my new role at Britten Sinfonia. My predecessor, David Butcher, had been in post for 28 years, since it had been started in '92. So, you know, really big shoes to fill. He did an amazing job across all that time. And obviously his absence, there's a lot of stuff that has left the organization with his departure because his brain has taken it away with him. However, there are other colleagues in the 10 or 11 piece management team that I'm working with now who've also been there quite some time. Not as long as David, but certainly, you know, 2, 5, 8 years themselves. And that is incredibly valuable for somebody starting a new job, because you rely on them for the cultural knowledge and background to a kind of osmosis process for that to feed into your own brain as you start learning the job and learning the nuances of how to do it well.
Brilliant.
I've just remembered the name of the composer that I'd forgotten, and it's Arlene Sierra.
Bravo.
And she's American, and she teaches at the at Cardiff University. And I'm very embarrassed that I forgot it earlier, but it's dropped into my brain now. So there you go. Brilliant.
So you've touched on this a bit before, but you've worked at both festivals and organisations with sort of, you know, year-long seasons. What are the main differences in either the administration or the programming of the two?
So obviously, with festival work, it's seasonal or has, well, when I started in that festival world, I thought that there were going to be peaks and troughs in the year, and that there'd be certain periods when you were just twiddling your thumbs and you could effectively just rock up at 11 and leave at 3, and you know, you'd balance that out with 20-hour days prior to and during the festival. Actually, in reality, I never quite understood this, but in reality, there were very few downtimes in the festival planning cycle. Even immediately after a festival, when actually the only thing you wanted to do was put your head in a towel or lie in a dark room for 3 weeks, or actually just go to Italy for 3 weeks. That's what I tended to try and do. But first, you'd have to send a whole load of thank you notes to hundreds of people, and if you write good thank you notes that are personalized and meaningful and sincerely felt, that actually takes quite a long time. So even straight after a festival, when you think you can just fall off the cliff and do nothing for a while, even then you've got stuff to do. And then when you're back from your time in the dark room or in Italy or wherever, you've already got quite a lot of the next year's festival planned already, because you try not just to do it in a 11-month cycle. You've tried to do it in a 18-month cycle and get the big building blocks of the next year's program already sorted. But even then, there's a hell of a lot more planning to do, and crucially, the whole fundraising machine starts kicking off. And within 3 months of the previous festival finishing, you're getting ready for a new fundraising launch of next year's program, where you want to make it as compelling and as attractive as possible to get people who've already given you lots of money earlier in the year. You want to get them coming along and promising loads of new money for the next year. So that's the kind of, and then after that, then it's just a whole load of admin and marketing and brochure copywriting and program book production, because I always rolled my sleeves up very much, because I mean, you heard earlier that I do a bit of writing as well, and so I always wanted to be very much involved in the print side of how you describe the festival, either through its brochure or through its big program book with program notes and biographies and introductions to concerts. All of that stuff I really wanted to get involved with, and so that's the festival planning cycle. The actual activity of the festival is only 2 weeks of a 52-week year, but and obviously hits a particular bout of intensity in that period running up to it, and then during the festival. But not as many peaks and troughs as you might have imagined. With concert seasons or opera seasons, obviously there are, I suppose in opera houses there are down times when you don't have shows on, but my understanding is that they're beginning to rehearse the shows whenever the theatre is dark, and getting ready for the next bout of the season anyway. So but generally speaking, with an orchestral program, it's non-stop. The concerts just keep on coming, but at a slightly less intense level as when the festival hits you. When I mean in Cheltenham, in my busiest years, there were 75 concerts in 12 days, and so that was 4 or 5 events minimum that you'd need to be at for everything, and often you'd be introducing them and at sponsors of receptions in the interval, and saying thank you to the artist afterwards, and then looking at your watch and just dashing off to the next one. So seriously, just 15-16 hour days of just non-stop during the festival. Incredibly satisfying and stimulating, but fantastically exhausting. And I remember my first year in Lichfield, my first festival year as director, was so stressy and so scary that when I was in Italy afterwards, I got a terrible bout of shingles, which I believe is stress related. So that tells you everything about how stressy the previous weeks have been, that I managed to have shingles when I was supposed to be relaxing on my summer holiday.
Oh yeah, sounds very stressful, but I can imagine it might be very rewarding in the end, or hopefully. So now, more changing subject, you've been involved in writing the children's book called The School of Music, and involved in the Young Artist program at the Britten Peers at Snape Maltings. And so my question was, what do you think is the role of arts during this sort of pandemic world, and what's the role of arts education after it?
Well, I mean, not wanting to sound too negative, but the situation wasn't brilliant before the middle of March regarding children's encounters with high quality music and high quality music education. When I say high quality, that isn't replacement words for classical music. I'm not advocating just a classical music education by any means, but we all know that music's role in the national curriculum is challenged, to say the least, and most young people's encounters with good music, or just hearing it, let alone learning about it or doing it, is minimal, and it's a desperate situation, and obviously has only got worse, and probably is going to be even more challenged going forward with all the, well, you know, the financial challenges that this country is going to face in the next few years, getting us out of this post-COVID hole. I can't imagine good music in state schools is going to be high on the list of many people's priorities. So it's a really worrying, awful, scary situation. And it's something that we all in the sector, in the music sector or in the arts sector generally, just need to be even more determined to counter with our own initiatives and projects and our own ideas, leading to fundraising, to leading to delivery of projects which just have to replace or complement whatever's happening in school. Going back to what I was saying about the power of the digital world that we live in, you know, that is obviously a really wonderful opportunity for us. We've all learned in the last few months how to get better at delivering things in front of a camera to put out there online, and I think that's going to become more and more important. The fact that we can communicate, we have learned to communicate better and quicker with large numbers of people from one space without having to, for one, to use an extreme situation, you don't have to bus an orchestra into a school hall now for school children to hear an orchestra. It's incredibly expensive and at the moment an impossible scenario. So the possibility of live streams and tuition via a web-based tuition and getting what we do so well and so imaginatively to as many people as possible has to be our challenge and our opportunity going forward. Does that sort of answer your question?
I believe so. We have a couple of questions from Fleur. I think maybe the second one would make the most sense following that question. Fleur, would you like to ask your question?
Hello, yes, that was really interesting, talking about the book and the reasons behind it. I was just wondering, in terms of someone or people who are starting off on that journey of thinking how to write a book for children that is musical and how to sort of put across that world, what advice would you give? What kind of do's and don'ts would you have?
Gosh, okay. So it's probably worth mentioning that I didn't set about to write that book. I was asked completely out of the blue by a commissioning editor from the publishing company, which still I find quite astounding, really. I think that person, well, I know that person because I asked her. I asked her, why on earth are you asking me? How did you find me? And this publishing house had previously produced a book called The School of Art, beautifully illustrated book on art for young people. And her idea as the commissioning editor was to follow that with a book on music called The School of Music. And she said that she, because the person who'd written the art one was a lecturer at Royal College of Art or something in London. And I think she apparently did lots of web research to find out who that equivalent is in the music world. And I think she scoured various university and music college websites to find out whether there was a kind of writer / educator on their books who might get the tone right for a 7 or a 10-year-old. And I think, I mean, I don't know how many of you are attached to university or have experience of further education, but suffice to say, she struggled to find somebody who apparently fitted the bill, because of course academic musicians, this is a terrible generalization, but generally speaking, they're writing for their peers and for a very, very high-end readership, academically speaking, and aren't necessarily going to have the right mindset or style of writing to be able to change gears right down for 7 to 11-year-olds. So I think she then started looking further afield to look at people who were involved with putting on children's concerts and perhaps who had a bit of a journalism background, and that's where she came across me, because I've, in my festival jobs especially, very much tried to upgrade the offer for families and for young people through concert experiences, as well as learning programs in schools. And as well, she stumbled upon some of my writing on websites. And so she literally did just send me an email completely out of the blue and said, I'm looking for somebody to write a book for children about music, and I'm just wondering whether you'd like to have a chat about it. And of course I immediately said yes, and we met up in London. And the first thing I said to her was, I'm really interested, but I'd like you to consider commissioning my wife as well, because my wife is she teaches music in schools for that age group. She's a singing teacher, and she conducts youth choirs and does class music, and you can imagine that therefore she has much more, and knows particularly how to pitch things for that age group. So the combination of me with my journalistic, sort of slightly more academic, professional experience of that world, combined with Rachel's on the ground experience in schools, seemed like a good combination. So I pitched that to Jenny, the commissioning editor, and she very happily went with it, and we co-wrote the book. We didn't sort of write every other sentence. We divvied up all the chapters, which were pretty much, because the School of Art book was 40 chapters long across 3 terms, and we were basically told by Jenny that the School of Music book needed to be 40 chapters or lessons divided across 3 terms. So the structure was dictated for us, and from there Rachel and I worked out how those 3 terms would be divvied up, and from there we worked out how we divvy up the chapters. So yeah, we co-wrote it, but in quite a sort of separate, discrete way. In answer to your question, the original question, which is how do you try and find the right voice for that age group? Trial and error. I think I wrote a load of stuff. We had to send some kind of pilot text to Jenny, the commissioning editor, just to see whether we were on the right track. And I obviously showed what I wrote to Rachel first, and she might have said, "Oh, you couldn't possibly say that to a 8-year-old. They won't know what you're talking about. You need to say that." Or Jenny might have come back and immediately said, "I really like the X and Y ideas, but A and B just isn't working." So it was an organic process, it's a tricky one, because the brief was to write for 7 to 11-year-olds, and any of you who either remember being 7 or 11, or maybe have people in your lives also who are 7 or 11, they're very, very different creatures. But in that age group, and our daughter is 10, and she's right in the middle of that, and she's incredibly different now than she was when she was 7, and she'll be different again when she's 11. So it's actually quite a tricky brief to write a book with a consistent voice or register, and in terms of content as well as style, that hits all of those things from a 7 to 11-year-old. And maybe it's hard for me to judge because I wrote it or I co-wrote it, but maybe other people would look at the book and think, oh God, that chapter's definitely for 11-year-olds and way off piste for a 7-year-old. I think what unifies it, of course, I don't know whether any of you have seen this book, but what unifies it is the illustration. It's incredibly distinctively, amusingly literally colorfully illustrated, and that binds everything. And in a way, I mean, funny enough, most people who've seen the book and commented on it back to us, especially when it came out, was, oh, we've seen your book, we love the illustrations, which sort of, we didn't, the great unasked question was, well, what did you think about the text? And I think we just had to conclude that people had bought the book and just looked at the pictures and put it down again. But I suppose some people have read it. Sadly, nobody is reading it now because, and you're the first people to know this, but we discovered recently, there's a website attached to the book that I spent ages building because I got a load of people to do special samples. I got Bryn Terfel and Nicola Benedetti and umpteen people you've heard of, to Sarah Connolly, Meurig Bowen, James Gilchrist, to do samples of what they do. You know, what does a soprano sound like? What does a violinist sound like? What does a synthesizer sound like? You know, it's a fantastic website. It took me ages. It took me longer than writing the book. And when you buy the book, you get the browser URL code to get through to the website, and it's kind of an enhancement of the book. I discovered a few months ago that if you plug in that web address now, you find yourselves on a really dodgy Russian porn site, and the browser has been basically hacked, and I believe, according to publishers, Russian extortionists have taken over the website and are trying to get the publisher to pay them a rather large amount of money to release the old website again, which of course they won't do because they probably don't have the money. So as a result of that, our book has been basically distribution has been cancelled, because the moment you sell the book, you're effectively selling to parents a porn site. Which is really, really disturbing. And we're sort of currently considering our options and whether we can try and get the publisher to rebuild the website with a different web address and reprint the book. But at the moment, if you try and buy it in the UK, I don't know about any other countries, but if you try and buy it in the UK, that is not possible, which is really sad because we spent a lot of time on it. And, you know, I think to some people it's a nice thing to have.
That's so sad. I'm so sorry to hear that. But thank you.
Yeah, it's the world we live in.
Everything else. And I hope that I don't know, I hope they find a way of fixing it.
Thank you.
Great, Meurig, thank you very much. Just to wrap things, we just wanted to ask you a final question, which would be, what are your plans now, like your cultural goals with the Britten Sinfonia?
At a fundamental level, just to come out of this lockdown in a robust way for the musicians and for my colleagues in the management, so that we can carry on functioning next year. We're in a pretty good place financially, relatively speaking. The furlough scheme has helped a lot, as you can imagine. But there's less work in the diary going forward than any of the orchestra will be used to from the last 15, 20 years. And it's my job to get new work for them and to create new opportunities that will be, at least in the short term, COVID compliant. And so that's quite a big creative challenge, trying to work out new concert formats and programming formats in different spaces where we might have a bit more flexibility than you would normally in a concert hall with fixed seating. So I'm thinking hard a lot about that at the moment, how we can get the orchestra back to work in a really satisfying and as busy as possible way, because ultimately people like me and my job in management, it's all about serving the musicians and the music. We don't have any purpose otherwise. And if there aren't any concerts happening and if the musicians aren't working, then there's no reason for me to have a job going in the future. So it's quite simply a challenge for us all, not just me, but to work out a way going forward where we can create work that works with government guidelines and with the natural caution and fears of audiences returning. Somehow we can balance the books and create really not just sort of half-baked, atmosphere-free events that you know where the only reason for it happening is so that you can say, oh, isn't it lovely that the musicians are working again or making music again. It's got to be better than that. It's got to be something that's really special and memorable, but inevitably in a different way. It's not, in the short to medium term, it's not going to be special just because you're in a space with 1,000 other people closely packed listening to an amazing piece of music brilliantly performed. That's not going to be possible. So we are going to have to find other ways of creating those experiences that work for COVID as well as our souls.
Thank you very much, Meurig. This has been a really, really informative hour. It's been almost like an amazing lecture. So thank you very much. And we wish you all the best in your new position at the Britten Symphony.
Well, thank you. Thanks very much for listening, being here.
Thank you, Meurig. So for all of you, if you're interested, next Thursday we will have Bob Holland, the Associate Artistic Director of ENO, and he will be speaking about programming opera and producing opera. So join us if you want at 6 p.m.